True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
In its immediate aftermath, the 1984 murder of Brenda Lafferty and her baby daughter had their community asking why. But once the investigation was underway, law enforcement began to look closely at the family that Brenda Lafferty had married into. Brenda was a devout Mormon, but she disagreed with the extreme religious beliefs of her brothers-in-law, Ron and Dan Lafferty, who had embraced fundamentalist views and were excommunicated from the LDS Church. Join us at the quiet end for Blood Atonement. Brenda's been described as a young woman who was dedicated to her husband Alan, their daughter, and their church. But Brenda had been raised in a more liberal Mormon family, and she wasn't afraid to openly disagree with her in-laws' fundamentalist views, which included polygamy. Following their excommunication, Dan and Ron Lafferty had become more and more fanatical in their beliefs, and they blamed Brenda when Alan refused to join them. So this case was recommended to us by Michelle D., who lives in Salt Lake City, Utah. So thank you, Michelle. I think this will make a good episode.
It's pretty interesting. I learned a lot. So today's beer review is Big Bad Baptist, which is brewed in Salt Lake City by Epic Brewing Company. It's a Russian Imperial Stout, pretty heavy hitter, 11.8% alcohol by volume. Pitch black beer, tiny tan head, very nice aroma, some alcohol, coffee, and chocolate. And the taste is even better. Coffee, chocolate, little hint of bourbon, and vanilla. This is a nice beer. It's a little tiny bit thinner in the mouth than I thought it would be, but it will make you feel pretty good.
That's good. Now, I like some of these terms. Can you explain to us what a little thin in the mouth means?
It's just not as robust as you would think. You know, it's a beer that's almost 12% alcohol, a lot of flavors and stuff going on, and it should kind of smack you in the face when you drink it.
Yeah.
And this is a little more timid than that.
Okay, makes sense. Well, let's open it up. All right, edge on over here to the quiet end. This is really kind of an intense story. Really a lot to it, so I'm looking forward to it, but I really need that beer.
Me too. So Brenda Wright was the second oldest in a family with 7 kids. Her mother, Lorraine, was a school teacher, and her father, Jim, was an agronomist. And for those of you like me that didn't know, an agronomist is an expert in the study of soil management and crop development. They're known as crop scientists, and they research the cultivation and use of plants. So Brenda was born in Logan, Utah, but she moved with her family to Ithaca, New York when she was still a baby. While in Ithaca, Jim worked toward his doctorate at Cornell, but as soon as he got his Ph.D., he moved his family back west to Twin Falls, Idaho. This was an agricultural town, and this is a town where Brenda and her siblings had what many described as idyllic childhoods.
Yeah, and Brenda was outgoing, energetic, very intelligent, and very friendly. She was involved in the school government, she was a member of the drill team, and she was always an honor student. She was pretty, too. In 1980, she was the first runner-up in the Miss Twin Falls pageant. So after graduating from high school, Brenda enrolled at the University of Idaho, where she was the president of her sorority. But Brenda really wasn't happy there, so she returned home to Twin Falls. She attended the College of Southern Idaho for 2 years, and then she transferred to Brigham Young University. While at BYU, Brenda joined a young adult ward, which is an LDS student congregation, and that's where she ended up meeting Alan Lafferty. Alan wasn't a student, but he joined that student ward anyway, and he and Brenda liked each other as soon as they met. So it didn't take long for them to begin dating, And it seems like it kind of veered her off her course and her plans for life a little bit.
More than a little bit. But Brenda majored in communications at BYU, and she anchored a television news magazine program on the local PBS affiliate. Her ambition was to become an anchorwoman on network TV. High goals. She and her sisters were brought up to be independent and self-sufficient.
Which was kind of unusual in the LDS Church, because it's a patriarchy.
That's for sure.
Yes. So Alan and Brenda were married on April 22nd, 1982, and they settled in American Fork. That's a small suburban town in Utah, and Alan ran a tiling business. But after Brenda got married, Alan didn't want her to work. So she put her broadcasting career on hold, thinking it would just be temporary, and she took a job at the mall just to get insurance and help support them. But it wasn't long before Alan started pressuring Brenda to quit that job too, because he wanted her to be a more traditional, subservient wife and mother. So I'm not sure if this was really something they discussed, or if they were just young and in love and kind of jumped into things. But he definitely wanted her to be financially dependent on him. And according to Brenda's mother, Brenda really did want to have a career in broadcast journalism. She had even been offered a job at BYU teaching in the communications department. But according to her sister, Alan wouldn't let her take the job. So Brenda became a housewife. And from what she would write in her journal, it seems that Brenda realized that she had made a mistake marrying Alan. But she was in love with him, and then she ended up pregnant just 2 months after their wedding day. And as a woman, once you get pregnant, that can really kind of set you on a course you weren't planning. If it's an accidental pregnancy, yes. But Brenda's family had actually liked Alan a lot from the very beginning. He was quickly accepted as a member of their family, and it wasn't until later that they learned how really fanatical the Lafferty family was. They'd kind of been hiding it, but once you were in there and got to know them, things were kind of weird.
So this was something that wasn't discussed between the two before they got married?
Well, we don't know, but it kind of seems like it wasn't. It seems like the two had different ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it's a surprise to Brenda that her husband felt this way.
It does seem that way, yeah. That's why I don't know how much discussion was made ahead of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's described as kind of a modern woman.
Right.
And she didn't think about this beforehand? Or didn't know about it?
Well, I'm sure she thought about it. We don't know. Did Alan kind of act differently? It wouldn't be unusual for someone to act differently to get the person that they're interested in to love them.
Yeah, I think so.
That certainly happens.
Yeah.
Maybe she thought she could do it all. A lot of women do, but this wasn't something that Alan wanted.
Well, even if she could do it all, he wouldn't allow her to do it.
Exactly. He might not. So it was a problem. Now, the Lafferty family were very well known and respected in that area. Watson Lafferty, Alan's father and the patriarch, was a chiropractor who ran a successful practice out of his house in downtown Provo. He and his wife Claudine had 6 boys and 2 girls, and Alan was the youngest. All of them were raised to have a profound devotion to the LDS religion. The family was admired by other LDS members for being righteous and hardworking. But the obedience of Watson's wife and children certainly did not come without any mental or physical abuse.
So this was an abusive household.
Yes. Well, they might not call it abuse because in the older LDS families, or maybe in all of them, I'm not sure, it is okay to have physical punishment, not just against your children, but against your wife.
Yeah.
And Watson certainly could be violent. We're going to learn about that.
Yeah, Watson's mother died of influenza when he was just a 5-year-old. Watson worked as a barber on an aircraft carrier during World War II, and after the war, he went to chiropractic college on the GI Bill. Afterwards, he opened a chiropractic practice, barber shop, and beauty salon, multifunctional, in a spare room in his home. He and his wife raised their kids to be devout Latter-day Saints. Watson spent a lot of his time thinking about God. And at the same time, he also spent a lot of time thinking about the government and how religion and government should interact. Even in ultra-conservative Mormon Utah County, Watson's far-right political views and religious convictions made him stand out. Those being kind described him as strict and strong-willed. In reality, though, he was a harsh disciplinarian who would severely beat his children or his wife, Claudine, in order to impose and enforce his rules. It wasn't uncommon for the Lafferty children to witness the physical punishment when Watson corrected, those are in parentheses, Claudine.
Yeah, that's really hard to imagine how you could have, well, it's just so patriarchal and abusive that you could have a father who disciplines your mother as if she's not an equal.
Right.
And, I guess that's how he felt. He must have.
Oh, absolutely.
But for me, a very disturbing story that's been told is that the children were there and they saw Watson club their family dog to death with a baseball bat. And that was some kind of punishment for the children to see that happen to their dog. I just can't imagine that.
Well, I can't either, but,
It's dreadful. I can't even imagine it. I mean, honest to God, I can't imagine that. I think if I was one of his children, I would have run away for good. I don't think I could have lived with that. How dreadful.
Now, Watson Lafferty also had a deep-seated distrust of conventional medicine. When his oldest daughter, Colleen, had acute appendicitis as a young girl, Watson was adamant that she be treated at home with only prayer and homeopathic remedies. It was only after her appendix burst and her death was imminent due to infection that he grudgingly took the suffering child to the hospital. And then, in 1983, Watson himself died from complications of advanced diabetes because he refused medical treatment, and this included taking insulin shots.
Well, you're not going to live very long if you're diabetic.
No, if you're a diabetic, a type 1 diabetic, and you're not taking your insulin, you're going to get sick pretty quickly.
You are. More than sick. You're going to die.
Yes, you are.
So Brenda's sister Betty would recall visiting Brenda and Alan one night when Brenda was pregnant with Erica, their daughter. Brenda had wanted to go out and get something to eat, but Alan refused to go to any restaurant that stayed open on Sundays. So they drove from place to place, and Alan made them sit and wait in the car while he went inside to find out if they were open on Sundays. So it wasn't even a Sunday. He just wouldn't go there if the place was open on Sundays. And each place was, so he wouldn't eat at any of them. After a while, Brenda became so frustrated that she just asked Alan to take them back home. Now, Alan had a successful tile business, but he also insisted on being paid in cash only. He didn't believe in having a checking account either because he didn't want the IRS to be able to track his income. He also didn't want to have a Social Security card. But Brenda didn't know any of this until after she had married Alan. So these all came as rude awakenings for her, that they weren't only ultra-religious, they were anti-government and anti-medicine.
They sure were.
Now, after he and Brenda had been married for a short time, she and her family began to notice that Alan was trying to get around the law in many different ways. Like when it was time to pay taxes that first year after they got married, Alan told Brenda that he wasn't going to pay them. Now, Brenda insisted that they would follow the law, and she had her dad help her fill out the tax forms for them. Then, when the car registration was due, Alan wouldn't let Brenda go and do that. So they were fighting about these things. But Brenda always made sure that these things got done. She somehow managed to pay the taxes, renew licenses, and pay their insurance premiums. So there was trouble right from the beginning between these two.
There sure was. It's a lot of conflict early on.
Really? It's like a whole different philosophy on life, which is hard to overcome.
Very.
Yeah.
So as the older Laffertys became more extreme in their religious beliefs, Brenda worked harder and harder to try to keep Alan from doing the same thing. She asked her sisters Betty and Sharon to keep an eye on Alan when his brothers visited, so she could keep track of how much time he was spending with them. She also persuaded him not to officially join the School of the Prophets, which was an extreme polygamous sect that believed in divine revelations. Brenda told Alan that she didn't want him doing things with his brothers, At the same time, the brothers blamed her for getting in the way and keeping Alan from his brothers.
Yes, now Ron was the oldest Lafferty brother, but it seems that Dan had the most influence over the family members after their father Watson died. Dan went to Scotland for his mission trip, and while there he met Matilda, a young divorced woman with 2 daughters. 6 years later, he saw her at a missionary reunion in the United States, and they got married quite quickly. After the marriage, they moved to Los Angeles so that he could follow in his father's footsteps and go to chiropractic school. Then the family moved back to Utah after he completed his training, and he began to work at the family business. Then he and Matilda had 4 children together.
And after they returned to Utah, Dan began to research Mormon history, which led him to discover the Peacemaker. Now, this is an obscure historical Mormon text printed in 1842 by Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. The text justified polygamy and described an even more patriarchal vision of marriage and parenting than the already conservative vision that the Laffertys were living. According to John Krakauer, in his book Under the Banner of Heaven, Matilda was no longer allowed to drive, handle money, or talk to anyone outside the family when Dan wasn't present. She had to wear a dress all the time. Soon, Dan was opposed to conventional medicine and public schooling. He threw out all of the non-Mormon books in the house, broke all of their clocks and watches, and spanked Matilda if she ever disobeyed him.
Well, and he'd seen his own father do that to his mother.
Sure.
Matilda's daughter Rebecca recalled her mother putting up a fight against Dan's increasingly extreme beliefs. So one time she let their chickens run loose in the house, and she said, "Okay, let's live free," and let the chickens run around and shit all over the house. According to Rebecca, Matilda also openly encouraged her husband to go ahead and find a second wife so that she could leave the marriage. But Matilda's rebellion did not work out for her. Dan began to beat her. Then he insisted that his ideal woman for a second wife was his 14-year-old stepdaughter, Matilda's daughter, Rebecca. Although he did eventually give up on that idea, he married a different woman, and eventually Matilda gave in to Dan's demands. She said that her only choices were to accept his rules or to leave him and leave her children behind with him. So she tried to stay.
Yeah, there weren't very good choices there.
No, it wasn't good.
Now, as he moved further into these fundamentalist Mormon beliefs, Dan became obsessed with libertarian ideas. Watson Sr. and Claudine left him and Brother Mark in charge of the family business when they went abroad on a mission trip in 1981. And while they were away, Dan refused to pay property taxes on his father's property. Dan believed that paying taxes meant that the government actually owned the property because they had the right to take it if you don't pay your taxes. And Dan was willing to force a standoff to decide who the real property owner was. So the state began the process of repossessing the property. But when Watson Sr. found out what was happening, he was enraged, and he had to pay taxes at the last minute in order to save his business. So he wasn't going to be real happy about that, was he?
No. Now, eventually, most of the Lafferty brothers joined Dan and became involved in Mormon fundamentalism and libertarianism. The conduit for their fundamentalism was a man named Bob Crossfield, a.k.a. Prophet Onias. He was the founder of the School of Prophets. Crossfield was from Canada, and he claimed to be a prophet. In addition to his other very objectionable beliefs, he was a racist, and he was opposed to black men becoming Mormon priests. When he was 19 years old, Ron Lafferty served a 2-year mission in Florida, and that's where he met Diana Sayer, who he married in Utah about 6 months later. They ended up having 6 children together. Ron and Diana lived in Highland, north of American Fork, where Alan and Brenda Lafferty lived with their baby daughter, Erica. Ron's younger brothers and sisters had looked up to him for counseling and emotional support since they were little kids. He was often the one who mediated their disagreements. Now, one of Ron's siblings characterized him as a mother-hen type back then. He seemed comfortable in that role. And then after he returned from his mission, he was available whenever his mother or his siblings needed him. By mid-1982, it was apparent to Diana that several of Ron's siblings needed his brotherly guidance.
Yeah, in August of 1982, Diana learned that 4 of the other 5 Lafferty wives were being made miserable by the fundamentalist strictures that Dan had been promoting. So she begged Ron to have a talk with Dan and his other brothers and straighten them out. So Ron agreed to pay them a visit.
Yeah, and it seems like this kind of backfired.
Boy, in a big way.
Yes.
So one evening, when his 5 brothers were meeting at their parents' Provo home to discuss religion and politics, Ron stopped by. This was the first time he had ever attended one of these meetings. So his brothers welcomed him, even when he began to read from an essay published by the LDS Church, warning of the evils of fundamentalism. As the discussion continued, Ron asked some pointed questions about Dan's new beliefs. He tried as hard as he could to persuade his younger brothers that Dan's crazy ideas were putting their eternal souls in serious jeopardy. So Ron was a devout LDS member, and he said that Dan was an embarrassment to the Mormon Church. Ron said there was no place in their church for extremes, but Dan argued with great passion that the LDS Church had taken a wrong turn when it had abandoned polygamy, and the only way to put it back on a true course was to adopt the sacred tenets advanced in the Peacemaker. Ron tried to refute Dan's arguments point by point, quoting scripture from the Bible and the Book of Mormon, but Dan countered with points of his own, drawn from the same texts as well as from the United States Constitution.
Yeah, so amazingly, Ron wasn't at that meeting for very long before he stopped trying to convince his brothers that they were wrong. And he said, "What you guys are doing is right. It's everyone else who's wrong." So in just a matter of hours, Dan had converted his big brother Ron into a fanatical Mormon fundamentalist.
Well, Ron must have been leaning in that direction anyway. I mean, I can't. 1 2-hour talk from the others caused him to do a 180.
I don't know. I think Dan was kind of convincing. I'm not sure how that works, Dick, but it was quite a shock for Diana, I'll tell you that.
I can imagine.
Now, she would tell a friend that when Ron returned home late that night, a totally different man walked in the door. He had fully accepted Dan's worldview, and then Ron became a regular at his brother's meetings as well. He threw away his driver's license and even removed the license plates from his truck. Then he quit his job, and he had a good job doing construction, being a contractor. So all of this was very alarming for Diana. They had a lot of kids, she wasn't allowed to work, and the family had already been on the verge of financial ruin.
Yeah, well, they're going to be there again.
Yeah, so Ron had been in the latter stages of a large construction project. This was a 4-unit apartment complex he had financed with a bank loan and was building himself as a business investment. Compounding their problems, the economy was in a recession. So Ron and Diana didn't make their loan payments, and there wasn't even enough money for food or clothing for their kids. Ron was really going to lose everything. The papers were already filed for the bank to take away their home. So as you can imagine, Diana felt quite powerless.
Yeah, Diana and Ron's lives changed radically for the worse when Ron began to share Dan's fundamentalist beliefs in 1982-1983. Diana had been happy with Ron, but she was shocked when he started to talk about polygamy.
Now, prior to 1982, people familiar with Ron described him as a really reasonable, strong family man. But then he began to spend more time with his brother Dan, and things really went kind of nuts. Diana went to Brenda and the leaders of her LDS community for help, and that was after Ron had quit his job and was being more and more abusive to her. His abuse led her to start divorce proceedings, and she separated from him, which was a really big deal. While Diana was going through the divorce procedures, Brenda was very supportive of her. And of course, the Lafferty brothers would not be happy with Brenda for that.
Oh no, she's meddling.
Yes. Now, Richard Stowe, the then president of the LDS Highland State, helped Diana financially until her divorce from Ron was finalized. And as soon as that was done, she moved to Florida and took all 6 children with her. By this time, Dan had been in trouble constantly for disobeying traffic laws, failing to pay taxes, and disobeying licensing regulations. And the more he spoke with Dan, Ron began to accept his ideas on government intervention. His appearance changed dramatically then. He went from a clean-cut guy to having long hair and a long, unkempt beard, and he would be described by some as looking like a mountain man.
Grizzly Adams.
Yeah.
Ron and Dan had regular meetings with their other brothers, Tim, Mark, and Watson Jr., to talk about religion and politics. They became more and more critical of the LDS Church, and as they strayed further away from societal norms, they were excommunicated from the LDS Church in 1983.
Yes, so eventually, the brothers opened their religious discussions to other men with similar beliefs. And that self-proclaimed prophet, Crossfield, told them that he had directions straight from God to teach the brothers how to organize themselves into the School of the Prophets. Then the brothers claimed that they were receiving communications directly from God, and they would meet to discuss these, which they called revelations. So the primary goal of the School of the Prophets was to teach followers how to receive and interpret messages directly from God. And Ron even had a journal where he would record the messages that he himself had received from God.
Okay.
So things were really getting radical. And it wasn't good because they were losing their families. Things just were not going well.
They didn't see it that way, did they?
No, they didn't. Not at all. They were really radicalized.
Around Thanksgiving of 1983, Ron went to Oregon to visit a polygamous commune. There, he was introduced to intoxicants. As part of their religious rituals, the group gave wine as a sacrament, and Ron participated. Now, raised in a dry household, this was his first experience with alcohol, and he liked it. He said that it heightened his sense of the spirit. It can do that, can't it?
It certainly can, but of course with violent men, it can make them more violent.
Doesn't help.
No.
Ron described wine as the gift of God. When he returned to Utah, he insisted that the School of Prophets substitute wine for the juice or water they normally served as a sacrament at the beginning of each of their meetings. This was a direct challenge to Robert Crossfield's authority in the School of Prophets.
Yeah, this really set up a dramatic confrontation during their March 9th meeting. On that occasion, Ron guzzled down glasses of wine after the sacrament was offered until he was really drunk. And then, in his inebriated state, he began to mock Crossfield, who had refused the wine and taken water instead, which was really in line with their beliefs. So according to Crossfield, Ron kept ridiculing him, and he said that the Lafferty brothers should take over, and he was supported by Dan and Watson Lafferty. And that's Watson Jr., of course, because by then, the dad was dead. Watson Sr. had died from his diabetes.
Right. So Ron and Dan shared their negative opinions about Alan's wife, Brenda, her baby, Erica.
Now, how do you have a negative opinion about a baby, for God's sake?
Well, they're going to tell you that the baby's going to grow up warped or something, so they might as well take care of her in her infancy.
Right, right.
Negative opinions also included Richard Stowe and Chloe Lowe, who were members of the LDS Church that had helped Diana Lafferty. They were two influential people in the church and in the lives of the Laffertys. According to Under the Banner of Heaven, Lowe counseled and helped Ron Lafferty's wife Diana in getting her divorce from him. Lowe's house had often served as a haven for Diana when Ron would become violent. Then, when she got the divorce, Lowe helped Diana and her kids move to Florida. As you might guess, this really infuriated Ron.
Oh, absolutely. You're not supposed to be meddling in this. So...
No, it's kind of brave.
You have to be brave, but I mean, really, what were her choices?
No, I mean, that and helping her. I mean,
Chloe Lowe.
This is not going to go well for any of them.
No, it's dangerous for her, absolutely.
It was during an April 5th meeting of the School of Prophets when Ron began to share his very negative feelings about 4 people who he had received a revelation about. These are the revelations from God, right?
Yes, he gets them directly from God and writes them in his notebook.
Wait, I don't have an in with God like that.
No, most of us don't.
Now, he claimed that God had come to him with a removal revelation, ordering 4 people to be killed. These were Chloe Lowe, Richard Stowe, Brenda Lafferty, and 15-month-old. Repeat that, 15-month-old Erica Lafferty. He believed that all 4 of these people had either helped his wife divorce him or played a part in his being excommunicated from the LDS Church.
Yeah, Ron believed that Brenda had encouraged his wife Diana to leave him and divorce him, which was true, but she had good reason. Before this removal revelation, he had called Brenda a bitch, and he'd told Alan that his wife had better stop talking to Diana and meddling in his affairs. Then, after the removal revelation, Ron said that Erica needed to be removed as well, because she would just grow up to be a bitch like her mother. Now, to me, this sounds a little bit more like anger than a religious thing. Like he just hates her. He hates Brenda.
Well, yes, but at the same time, the revelation includes 4 people that they're pissed off about.
Right.
So, I mean, it's not like, let's do something to the hairdresser down the street. It's those specific 4 people.
It's those specific 4 people, but you have to think, he's angry at these 4 people for whatever his reasons are, and then he just happens to get this revelation from God that they need to be removed. Well, that's awfully convenient.
Right.
That God's telling him this. That's all I'm saying.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah. Well, I know we agree. We're just coming at it from a different angle. But just the idea that you would need to eliminate a 15-month-old is disgusting.
That's just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it really is. So Chloe Lowe was a friend of Diana's, and she had encouraged her to leave Ron. Richard Stowe was Ron and Diana's ecclesiastical leader in the LDS Church and a member of the church council, which had decided to excommunicate him. He had also talked with Diana and helped her get financial help from the LDS Church. Along with the removal revelation, Ron also claimed to have received another revelation, and this was on March 13, 1984. This revelation ordered him and the School of Prophets to be used in the removal of these 4 people, but only his brothers Dan and Watson agreed with him on this. The others in the group felt that this was just not God's will, and they disassociated themselves from Ron's revelations.
At least some of them got some message there, huh?
Yeah, some of them weren't willing to go to the length of murdering people.
Yeah. Including 15-month-olds.
Gosh, yeah. So the group was disbanded because of this disagreement. But Ron and Dan continued to believe that the revelation removal did need to be fulfilled. So it's very scary.
Huh, isn't it?
Terrifying. And I'm not sure if these other members went to anyone. It seems like they didn't give anyone any warning.
So Brenda especially had pissed Ron and Dan off. She had been married to Alan for about 2 years, and she had prohibited their younger brother Alan from joining the new sect. She was also college-educated, progressive, and assertive. Just the kind of woman that the brothers would like.
Right.
She certainly did not go along with their view that women should be subservient to their husbands.
Yeah, so
although
it's
that's
really...
what she's doing with her husband.
She kind of is, and that's why I was just coming in to say we're not really sure what was going on with Alan Lafferty, because he did seem to be less radicalized, but still he did seem to be really involved in this patriarchy, and he didn't want her to be progressive, assertive, any of that.
Well, he was like maybe a junior member or a light member.
Well, I think he may have been kind of caught between, like his brothers wanted him to go that way, and she forbid it as his wife, So he was trying to maybe just kind of walk the line there in between.
Yeah, he's looking for the best of both worlds kind of thing.
Well, I think so.
Not the best maybe, but some way to intermingle the two.
Right, because he certainly did have some radical beliefs with the government and things like that.
Yes, he did. So on the morning of July 24th, 1984, Alan Lafferty left the small duplex apartment he shared with his wife and daughter. He left before the sun was up to travel about 80 miles so he could work at a construction site. Now, during his lunch break, he called Brenda, and they chatted before putting Erica, the daughter, on the phone. Erica babbled as Alan spoke to her for about a minute. Then Brenda took the phone from the baby and told Alan that everything was fine, and they said goodbye.
Ron and Dan Lafferty had plans to go to Salt Lake City that day with their friends, Chip Carnes and Ricky Knapp. Before leaving, Ron told the others that they should go to his brother Mark's house to get a rifle. Then once at Mark's, Mark asked Ron what they were going to do with the gun. He knew that Ron had not hunted in years, but Ron told him that he was going hunting for any fucking thing that gets in my way. So yikes.
That's a little ominous.
It really is. So then the four men headed for Alan's apartment, supposedly looking for another rifle. On their way in the car, Dan and Ron, though, discussed if the removal revelation should be fulfilled on that day. And when they reached the apartment, Ron got out of the car and knocked on the front door, while the other three stayed inside the car. When no one answered, Ron went back to the car and drove off for Salt Lake City. But before they got very far, Dan said that they should turn back and return to Alan's apartment. So we have to think at this point he decided he was going to go through with the murders.
Yeah, he must have gotten another revelation that Brenda was home.
Yes. So when they got there, Dan went to the door and knocked, and Brenda answered the door. After she opened the door, Dan pushed his way into the apartment. He was alone inside with Brenda when the other three men heard arguing coming from inside of the apartment. That's when Ron got out of the car and went inside, too. Chip Carnes heard Ron call Brenda a bitch and a liar. Then he heard her being physically assaulted. From out in the car in the driveway, Chip heard Brenda begging them not to hurt her baby. They could hear the baby crying by then. And then the sounds just completely stopped quite abruptly. A few minutes after that, Dan and Ron came out from the back of the apartment and got back into the car. And they both had blood all over their clothes. After leaving Brenda, the men drove to the home of Chloe Lowe. On their way, Ron told the others that she would be an easy target because she was very small. But when they got there, no one was home. So the men broke in and stole some things. When they left the Lowe house, Ron began to talk about going to Richard Stowe's house. But they accidentally missed the turnoff to Stowe's house. Dan and Ron then decided not to complete their removal revelation that day. So they stopped at a gas station and then drove on toward Wendover, which is a border town of Nevada. And as they traveled, Ron pulled a knife out of his boot and started to hit it on his knee, repeating, "I killed her, I killed her, I killed the bitch. I can't believe I killed her." Then he handed the knife over to Dan and said, "Thank you, brother, for doing the baby, because I don't think I had it in me." And Dan answered, "No problem." So this is all so disturbing.
And once the four men arrived in Wendover, they rented a small kitchenette apartment where they cleaned themselves up, ate, and slept. That evening, Alan arrived home around 8 p.m. He had a long day, didn't he? He left before the sun went up, and he's back home at 8.
Yeah, no one ever said he wasn't a hard worker. He was.
He walked up to the front door, and he was surprised to find it locked. Brenda almost never locked their doors, so Alan used his key to enter. Then another surprise once he got inside was there was a baseball game blaring from the living room television. Neither he nor Brenda liked baseball, and they never watched it. So after he turned off the TV, the apartment seemed eerily quiet, like nobody was even home. So Alan guessed that Brenda had taken the baby and gone out somewhere. He turned back to go and see if they were at the neighbor's house, That's when he noticed some blood on a light switch near the door. That's also the same time that he saw Brenda sprawled on the kitchen floor in a puddle of blood. He called her name and got no response. Then he knelt down beside her and put a hand on her shoulder. She was cold, and there was blood all over her face and body. Brenda had been badly beaten, and she had cuts and bruises on her face, head, arms, and legs. There was also evidence of strangulation. A vacuum cord had been tightly wrapped around her neck, and her throat had been cut.
So it's kind of overkill, which gives me this whole idea of rage.
Rage.
Yeah.
Her throat had been cut, in addition to the strangulation. There was a 6-inch long incision through her trachea, both jugular veins, both carotid arteries, and down to her spinal column.
So almost beheaded, really.
Almost decapitated.
Yeah.
There was more blood smeared on the walls, drapes, and door. So Alan reached for the kitchen phone, which was lying on the floor next to Brenda's body, and dialed 911 before he noticed that there wasn't a dial tone. The cord had been pulled out from the wall. He walked to their bedroom to try the extension in there, and that's when he saw his baby Erica.
Now this is horrific. I just can't even imagine that this is true. I know it is, but why would anyone do that?
She was slumped over in her crib, motionless. She was wearing only a diaper, which was soaked with blood. Her bedding was also stained with blood. Alan then rushed to the master bedroom, but that phone wasn't working either. So he went next door to a neighbor's apartment where he was finally able to call 911.
Yes, Alan told the 911 operator what he had found, and then he called his mother. While he waited for the police to come, he returned to his apartment. He went to Brenda's side and he prayed. For the first time, he noticed that the blood wasn't only in the kitchen and in the baby's room. It was smeared over the living room walls, the floor, and the curtains. And he knew who was responsible. Actually, he'd known it the moment he'd first seen Brenda lying on the kitchen floor.
Oh, sure.
15-month-old Erica was found in a puddle of her own blood. She was awkwardly propped up against the back of her crib with her head slumped forward. Her throat had been cut all the way from ear to ear, and this 5.5-inch incision had sliced through both of her carotid arteries, both jugular veins, her esophagus, and her cervical spine.
Yeah, so only a little bit of bone, a little bit of tissue kept her head on her body.
Yeah, it's just horrible. Now, after the police arrived, they took Alan to the American Fork police station, and they interrogated him all night. He's the husband, right? But after some time, Alan was able to convince them that the prime suspects were actually his brothers, Dan and Ron Lafferty.
Yeah, Ron had just returned to Utah County after spending most of the past 3 months traveling around the West with Dan. An APB went out for Ron's car, which was a pale green 1974 Impala station wagon with Utah plates. The two murders appeared to be ritualistic, and that would draw a lot of attention from the media and frighten the public. By the next evening, the Lafferty murders were the biggest news in papers all across the state.
Oh, really, they were. On Thursday, July 26th, a headline on the front page of the Salt Lake Tribune announced, "Widespread search underway for American Fork murder suspect." And immediately below this story, also on the front page, was another piece. Neighbors recall changes in murder suspect 42. And this was referring to Ron Lafferty. Detectives interviewed as many of Alan's siblings as they could find, as well as his mother and some friends. The front page of that Saturday's Tribune read, 2 murders, a religious revelation, 3 charged in slashing of mother and infant. So that revealed that the police were beginning to put together a motive for these 2 brutal killings. Immediately after the murders, detectives removed most of Brenda's possessions from the apartment, which she'd shared with Alan, as evidence. After the police had gone through it all, they put the things they didn't need for the investigation into a storage unit. Alan never paid the rental fee, so the storage company called, and Brenda's mother and sister drove to American Fork to get Brenda's stuff. Eventually, Brenda's father started looking through her journals, scrapbooks, and personal items. And that's the point when he finally fell apart emotionally, crying and blaming himself for his daughter and his granddaughter's murders. As Brenda's father, he thought he should have been able to protect her, but he couldn't. And he would really struggle with this over the years to come, and, probably till the end of his life, this would be a struggle.
On July 30th, Ron's 10-year-old Impala was found parked in front of a house in Cheyenne, Wyoming. So the police raided the home, but they didn't find the Lafferty brothers. However, they did find and arrest Richard Knapp and Chip Carnes, the two drifters who had been traveling around the West with the Laffertys since early that summer.
Right, and they had been in the car when the murders were done.
Yeah, they never entered the house.
No, they didn't. Now, information given to the police by Knapp and Carnes led them to Reno, Nevada, where on August 7th the police arrested Ron and Dan as they were standing in line for the buffet at the Circus Casino. From jail, the brothers launched a media campaign claiming their innocence. Ron insisted that the charges against them were false and that the Mormon Church, which he said controlled everything in Utah, would prevent his brother and him from getting a fair trial. So although he confessed to believing in the righteousness of plural marriage, Ron said he had never practiced polygamy or belonged to any extremist sect. He then professed to love the Mormon Church, while at the same time warning that the current LDS leadership had strayed from the sacred doctrines of the religion's founding prophet, Joseph Smith. 4 days later, Dan Lafferty issued a written statement to the media in which he declared that he and Ron were not guilty of any of the crimes for which we have been accused. So on December 29th, 5 days before their trial was scheduled to begin in Provo, Lieutenant Jerry Scott, the commander of the Utah County Jail, took Dan from his cell to ask him some questions. When Dan was returned, he found Ron hanging by his neck from a towel rack in his adjacent cell. He was unconscious and not breathing. Ron had used a T-shirt to hang himself, so Dan pushed the intercom button to call for help, and Lieutenant Scott arrived immediately, but Ron had no apparent pulse. Although Scott and 2 other deputies began CPR on Ron, they were unable to revive him. By the time the paramedics showed up, Ron appeared to be dead. But despite the fact that Ron had stopped breathing for about 15 minutes, the paramedics were able to get his heart beating again. Then he was put on a respirator in the intensive care unit of the Utah Valley Regional Medical Center.
After remaining comatose for 2 days, he regained consciousness. Dan attributed his recovery to divine intervention.
Of course he did.
Well, something worked for him. He was dead.
He was dead. His heart may have been beating and they just couldn't tell. It may have been a weak pulse. I don't know. But you're right, yeah. He certainly would have died without intervention.
Yeah. Although the brothers had been scheduled to be tried together 3 days after Ron woke from his coma, the judge ordered that Dan should be tried alone, as scheduled. Ron would be given time to recover and to have an extensive psychiatric evaluation to determine if he had significant brain damage.
Yes, the court assigned 2 attorneys to represent Dan, but he insisted on defending himself.
Of course he did.
5 days after the trial began, the jury went into deliberation, and 9 hours later, Dan was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. During the court session, to determine whether Dan should be put to death for his crimes, Dan told the jurors that he would not appeal if they determined he should get the death sentence. So 10 jurors voted for death, but 2 others refused to go along with the majority. And because it had to be unanimous, Dan's life was spared. According to the jury foreman, one of the jurors who hesitated to agree to a death sentence was a woman whom Dan had manipulated through eye contact, smiles, and other charismatic nonverbal seduction, which had caused her to ignore the evidence and the instructions that were provided by the judge. So the foreman was outraged by this, and he believed that Dan had avoided a death sentence by manipulating this woman on the jury.
I'd love to know what charismatic nonverbal seduction looks like.
I know, but it is true that everyone said that Dan and Ron could be, very charismatic.
Yeah, I was just grouching about the choice of verbiage here.
Well, I'm sorry, that's how I saw it.
But certainly, yeah, he can flirt or seduce or do whatever
And we don't know that that's the reason anyway. That's just what the foreman said.
Right.
Right. When talking to Dan in his sentencing, the judge reminded Dan that it was man's law which you disdain that saved your life. Then, thoroughly disgusted, he added, "In my 12 years as a judge, I have never presided over a trial of such a cruel, heinous, pointless, and senseless crime as the murders of Brenda and Erica Lafferty. Nor have I seen an accused who had so little remorse or feeling." After telling the court that the jury had been unable to agree on a sentence of death, the judge turned to Dan and he said, "I mean to see that every minute of your life is spent behind bars of the Utah State Prison, and I so order." And then he sentenced Dan to 2 life terms.
So Brother Ron was found incompetent and was sent to the state hospital for further treatment. After his 4th competency hearing, the court did find him competent. So a jury trial began on April 25, 1985, and Ron was found guilty on all counts on May 7th. He was sentenced to death. So after failed appeal, Ron filed a federal habeas corpus petition saying that the state trial court had applied the wrong legal standard to determine his competency. And that worked. His convictions and sentences were then vacated.
Yeah, but then Ron was charged again with 2 counts of first-degree felony criminal homicide, first-degree aggravated burglary, and second-degree conspiracy to commit criminal homicide. The state of Utah wasn't happy about having to throw out Ron Lafferty's conviction and give him a new trial. A hearing was held in late 1992 where 3 doctors, after examining Ron, convinced the 4th District Court in Provo that he was not fit to stand trial. So having been found incompetent, Ron was transferred from death row to the Utah State Hospital. But the state wouldn't abandon its efforts to convict and execute Ron Lafferty for these murders. In August of 1995, during the many rounds of motions and hearings before Ron Lafferty's retrial, there was one time when both Dan and Ron were brought into the courtroom at the same time. And when this happened, their eyes met, and Ron said, "Hey bro, what's happening?" "Good to see you," Dan answered and smiled at him. It was the first time the brothers had spoken to each other in 11 years, since they'd been locked up together originally in the Utah County Jail.
Yeah, we've talked about how the wheels of justice move slowly. And in this case is another example. It was 10 years from the sentencing to this point. The original sentencing was 1985, and now we're up to 1995.
Right.
Still fighting over this stuff.
Oh yeah, it was quite a thing.
So despite their friendly meeting in the courtroom, by that point Dan had decided that Ron was a child of the devil. He was an agent of Satan who was bound and determined to kill Dan in order to prevent him from fulfilling the rest of the vital mission that God had given Dan to complete. Dan did have good reason to believe that Ron wanted to kill him, because when they were last together, Ron had tried just that.
Yeah, he had. It happened back in December of 1984, 5 months after the murders, while they were sharing a cell in the Utah County Jail. Dan had been lying in his bunk trying to sleep when he opened his eyes and he saw Ron creeping up on him. Caught in the act, Ron stopped and then went back to his own bunk. But then he asked Dan if he thought Ron would be able to kill someone as big as him. So from that moment on, Dan was careful to watch his back. That night passed without any more incidents, but the next day, while Dan was standing in their cell, Ron blindsided him by punching him in the left temple. Dan was really stunned, but remained conscious. Then, as he turned to face Ron, Ron came at him with both fists, smashing Dan's nose and loosening several of his teeth and breaking one of his ribs. Dan, who kept his hands by his sides and offered no resistance to this, later said that Ron didn't stop beating him until his hands hurt too bad to hit him anymore. And by then there was blood all over the floor and the walls of the cell. Now at the time, Dan explained the assault by saying that Ron was having bad spirits. After the beating, their jailers separated the brothers, putting them in adjoining cells. And not long after that, Ron handed Dan a piece of paper through the bars. Written on it was a revelation that Ron said he'd just received from God. God commanded Dan to let Ron kill him, it read. After praying for guidance, Dan discussed with Ron how it might be done, and they thought together that the best way might be for Dan to back up to the bars and let Ron put a towel around his neck and strangle him. So as soon as Dan agreed to let Ron kill him, he said he felt the urge to vacate his bowels, and he interpreted this as a sign that the revelation was valid and should be followed. So he believed that his emptying his bowels was part of God's plan, so that he wouldn't make a mess when he was killed by his brother.
What twisted logic.
Yeah, it really is.
So after finishing on the toilet, Dan said goodbye to Ron and anticipated seeing God. He backed up to the bars, and Ron put a towel around his neck. On his side of the partition, Ron stood on one foot, braced the other foot against the bars, and then pulled the towel against Dan's throat as hard as he could, and held it there, so he was cutting off the oxygen to Dan's brain. This was also giving him burst blood vessels in his eyes, and probably on his upper face, the petechiae we've talked about in other cases. Now, just before he lost consciousness, Dan experienced a moment of desperation. Then the next thing he would remember was waking up on the floor of the cell.
Yeah, it turns out that after Dan blacked out and went limp against the bars, Ron felt God telling him that if Dan took another breath, it was a sign that he was supposed to live. When Ron saw Dan's chest rise a moment later, he let Dan fall to the floor. Dan's eyes had turned bright red from all the ruptured blood vessels, and the skin had been scraped off the back of his neck by a jail bar. But he kept breathing. The next day, Ron started showing signs of torment even worse than he had before. He paced back and forth in his cell, mumbling to himself that he would get one more chance and he would do it right this time. Then a couple of days later, he handed Dan another revelation that said Dan was supposed to let him kill him again. But then when Dan prayed about this, he didn't feel like he was supposed to let his brother kill him. So when Dan told Ron that he wasn't going to comply with the revelation this time, Ron seemed to become even more tormented. So back after his 16 months of psychotherapy, which included putting Ron on antidepressant and antipsychotic medications, another competency hearing was held. This was in February of 1994. And this time the team of psychiatrists put together by the prosecution were more persuasive than the psychiatrists hired by the defense. They ruled that Ron was now sufficiently competent to be tried again for killing Brenda and Erica Lafferty. The trial was delayed after the defense filed motions, but jury selection began in February of 1996. Ron had verbal and physical outbursts during his trial and had to be removed from the courtroom. Questions of his competency were raised again, and the state moved to determine if another competency hearing was needed. The 8 experts who had previously evaluated him were ordered to do it again. The following month, in March of 1996, the expert witnesses for the prosecution decided that Ron Lafferty was competent to stand trial, but the experts for the defense said that he was mentally ill and not competent. After evaluating all of these expert opinions, the court ultimately decided that he was competent to stand trial. So Ron's trial ran from March 25, 1996 to April 10, 1996. This jury returned with guilty verdicts on all charges. The court met on May 31st to impose his sentence. But before doing so, the judge asked Ron if there was anything he wanted to say. Ron answered the judge, "Go ahead and do what you gotta do, you little political punk, because that's all you are is a fucking punk, Stevie Wonder." So I don't know why he said Stevie Wonder, if the judge was a black man and that was a racist thing. I'm not sure. But Ron continued on like this for several minutes, calling the judge names like a fucking idiot who comes to work in a dress. When the judge calmly asked him if he had made his final statement, Ron said, "Well, my final statement is you can kiss my butt, pal. That will pretty well cover it." Wouldn't do any good to go any further. Hell, I'm talking to myself right now, probably. So he was really weird.
Yes, he was.
So after confirming that Ron had finished addressing the court, the judge said, "It is hereby adjudged and ordered that the defendant be sentenced to death." He then asked Ron whether he preferred to be executed by firing squad or by lethal intravenous injection. "I don't prefer either one," Ron answered. "I prefer to live. That's what I prefer." So the judge told him, "If you don't indicate to me what you prefer, I'm going to impose lethal injection as your method of execution." And Ron yelled at him, "I've already had the lethal injection of Mormonism, and I kind of wanted to try something different this time, so I'll take the firing squad." How's that? Is that pretty clear? So the judge said that's clear, and sentenced Ron to be shot to death for his crimes.
Ron's attorney filed a series of appeals on Ron's behalf, eventually taking the case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In November 2001, the justices declined to hear Ron's appeal, leaving him to be killed by the state of Utah. During his 1996 retrial, the state had been able to convince a 12-person jury that Ron wasn't psychotic and that he was fully aware of what he was doing when he participated in the murders of Brenda and Erica Lafferty. Many Utah residents believe that Ron's outbursts in court and his weird religious pronouncements were an act. Many believe that he is acting crazy to avoid a death sentence. They also speculated that Ron's claims to have received revelations from God were just another attempt to manipulate and deceive. But almost nobody doubted the sincerity of his brother Dan's religious faith. Most people in Utah saw Dan's religious beliefs as both preposterous and horrific, but they would concede that he seemed to be a true believer.
What Dan believed in 2003 when he was interviewed by the author John Krakauer was not exactly what he believed back when he had killed Brenda and Erica. He would claim that his beliefs went through a major evolution after he went to prison. He no longer subscribed to the tenets of Mormon fundamentalism. He said that he changed gods and he had forsaken fundamentalism. His theology became a disturbing mix of beliefs from the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Book of Mormon, fundamentalist scripture, and some inventions from his own mind.
And that's quite a mishmash.
Yeah. So Dan said all modern religions are fraudulent, not just the LDS Church. He said that organized religion is hate masquerading as love. And this led him back to religion as it originally existed before it was corrupted. It led him to become a fundamentalist. But then he said he found out that there weren't answers in fundamentalism either. At the center of Dan's new faith was his conviction that he is Elijah, the biblical prophet known for his solitary ways and for his unyielding devotion to God. According to Dan, he was here to prepare the way for the return of the Son of Man, and Dan believed, as he did when he was a fundamentalist Mormon, that the most salient fact of existence is the immutable division of humankind into those who are inherently righteous and those who are inherently evil. So very black and white. Dan explained to Krakauer that some people were chosen to be the children of God and others became children of the devil. Either you're a brother, a child of God, or an asshole, a child of the devil. And you can't do anything to change it, he said.
Dan also said that he should have recognized that Ron was one of Satan's minions back in the spring and summer of 1984, when he and Ron were driving across the West in Ron's Impala, because his brother was showing signs of schizophrenia. And as they were traveling together and getting to know more and more about each other, it was common for Ron to kind of space out and go somewhere mentally. Dan now suspected that at such times he was probably listening to voices. And those voices, Dan speculated, were his instructions from the devil. John Krakauer's book, Under the Banner of Heaven, was released in 2003. The book had information from statements he got from the Lafferty brothers. Dan Lafferty said at the time that he considered the book to be part of God's plan for him to spread his strange revelation.
So in November of 2019, Ron died of natural causes in prison. He had been on death row for 34 years. So Dan Lafferty remains in the Utah State Prison serving a life sentence. An interesting and tragic aside is about this family murder-suicide, which happened on September 27, 2014, in Springville, Utah. So this young woman, Christy Strack, was a friend of a daughter of Dan Lafferty, and she frequently visited with him in prison. The Strack family of 5 was found dead in the upstairs bedroom of their Springville, Utah home. Benjamin and Christy Strack, the parents, took their own lives and the lives of their 3 children after suffering from long-term mental illness and some substance abuse issues. The Stracks were found dead by an older son, Jansen McGee. So there were cups of red liquid next to the bodies. And the children, Benson, who was 14, Emery, who was 12, and Zion, who was 11, were found lying on and around the bed, covered with blankets up to their necks, with empty bottles of liquid methadone and boxes of cold and flu medication nearby. Investigators determined the cause of death to be intentional poisoning. Family members who were cleaning out the Strack's home a few days after the deaths found a notebook with a letter inside, written by Benson Strack to one of his best friends. Benson's the 14-year-old. And it indicated that Benson was aware that something was going to happen, and he even had an idea that he might be found dead someday. So this was a real tragedy. The grieving family members said that Benjamin, who was 37, and Christy, 36, had been showing signs of mental illness, especially in the weeks leading up to their deaths. They had isolated themselves from neighbors and some of the family, and it had been a while since Ben had even been to work. Another relative said that Benjamin and Christy were also showing irrational fear that something or someone was going to harm them.
Police say the couple had a relationship with Lafferty that began in 2005 after Christy read the book Under the Banner of Heaven. Dan Lafferty told one reporter that it started when Christy Strack reached out to him, writing him a letter, and they began a relationship. Lafferty said that they became very close, and they showed up for all the visits that he was allowed, which is about 3 times a month. Lafferty said that he sent his long beard to the couple when he cut it off at Christy's request. He said that their relationship had become strained because he insisted that he is the prophet Elijah. Christy, according to Lafferty, did not believe him, and after 2008 she stopped answering his letters. So Lafferty claimed that they never talked about suicide and that he didn't know of any plans, but he did seem to think that his influence may have been greater than he initially told investigators. Lafferty said that his belief that this is hell that we are living in now, and the reason we're going through all that is to get to the second coming, and that influenced the couple. Additionally, Lafferty claimed that Christy Strack and he were in love, and that Ben was aware of it but not bothered by it.
Yeah, so while Ron and Dan Lafferty were fanatical about their religious beliefs and the group the School of Prophets, Brenda's sister and Erica's aunt, Sharon Wright Weeks, said in a 2022 Deseret News article that religion was such a small part of Ron and Dan Lafferty's views, which she said were way more extreme governmentally. Religion had nothing to do with the reason Brenda and Erica were murdered, Weeks said. She added that anyone who paid attention to the court cases, especially the 1996 retrial, would know prosecutors accused Ron Lafferty of using his religious views as a cover for what was really a crime of passion. So this story does not necessarily reflect well on the LDS Church, does it? I mean, it did stray away from the mainstream, but they did look back on the history of the religion and use a lot of that.
Yes.
So more so than the real-life story of these murders, the book Under the Banner of Heaven and the subsequent mini-series of the same name really does have some non-flattering views on the religion. You know, like especially looking back on the history of the religion and the story of Joseph Smith. So what has the LDS Church said in response?
Well, in response to Krakauer's 2003 book, the Church provided 3 different opinions on its depiction of Mormonism. And all of them were very critical of how Krakauer portrayed LDS. One response from the church's then director of media relations, Mike Otterson, stated that the book does a huge disservice to its readers by relying on stereotypes. In a statement, Otterson said that Krakauer's portrayal of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is utterly at odds with what he, and millions like him, have come to know of the Church, its goodness, and the decency of people. I don't know, I think that's a non-response, but that's okay.
Well, it's his opinion.
Yeah, but he's just saying words.
Well, what else would he say if not words? What are you getting at? Why do you find it as a non-answer?
Well, it's a non-answer because he's already in the church. He knows how good it is and how decent the people are. So there's nothing that's going to change his mind.
Oh, I see. Well, of course not. No, we wouldn't expect it would.
In a review of the book by Robert Millett, then a professor of religious understanding at Brigham Young University, went into great detail to critique and correct aspects of Krakauer's book, such as what he wrote about plural marriage. Millett said, "Under the Banner of Heaven is not only a slap in the face of modern Latter-day Saints, but also a misrepresentation of religion in general."
Yeah, he said, "It is an insult to those unreasonable beings out there who rely upon the murky sectors of the heart and head that prompt most of us to believe in God, and compel an impassioned few, predictably, to carry that irrational belief to its logical end. This book is an attempt to tell the story of the so-called fundamentalist or polygamist groups in Utah, and to tie their beliefs to the doctrines and the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." And he said the result is a full frontal assault on the veracity of the modern church. Well, I can see that the modern church doesn't have these beliefs, but the history is valid.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is. So the LDS Church did not comment on the miniseries, but Brenda's sister did say that the miniseries was fiction, and the portrayal of her sister was inaccurate.
Yeah, for the most part, she was saying her sister was much more of a devout Mormon than she was portrayed in the book or in the miniseries. Like, maybe not as progressive as she was portrayed.
Possibly. And she certainly didn't abandon the religion.
She didn't, and she may have been more religious than we know. So, it's just a real tragedy. Regardless of the religion, there's just the whole murder and the fact that they were angry with her and the other people.
Yeah, and I'll agree with what you wrote, or maybe it was Krakauer, but using the killings as a revelation from God when it was more likely a crime of passion.
Exactly, yes. The sister said that, yeah. So, a quick reminder to our listeners before we move on to our feedback segment. We have a premium option of TCB, which gives you early ad-free and bonus shows. We always do a bonus case each month, plus we often throw in a recap and a discussion of a true crime show. These are episodes that are more laid back than our regular shows, and we have a lot of fun doing them. So if you're interested, I hope you'll subscribe. Just go to tiegrabber.com/subscribe. You can also subscribe on our Patreon page at patreon.com/tiegrabber and get the same benefits. We also urge you to give us a 5-star review if you haven't yet. You can do that on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And we do love to hear from you, so please send us an email or a voicemail if you have any feedback on a case we've covered or a case suggestion for a future show. And you can send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com or record a voicemail from our website or just by clicking on the show notes. So we really do thank you for spending your time with us at the quiet end, and I'm really excited with today's feedback.
Well, aren't you nice?
It's time for listener feedback.
Today I picked a voicemail and a couple emails to go over for our feedback.
Sounds great.
So the voicemail is one sent by Megan, and she has a case suggestion and kind of a beer suggestion. She's recommended a whole brewery.
Oh, well, that's nice.
So, should be interesting.
Hi, Dick and Jill. Big fan. Really appreciate all the hard work and research that you put into the podcast. My name's Megan. I have come with a beer recommendation and a case recommendation today. So both are based in the north of Ireland, or Northern Ireland. The beer I want to recommend is, well, it's a brewery, in fact, but it is Heaney Brewery, named after Seamus Heaney, the poet. It's based in his actual home turf, so it's really, really good stuff. My dad, who only drinks lager, loves it, so that's a good endorsement. I want to recommend the case of Natalie McNally, which has just very recently happened here just at Christmas time, and I don't want to get into too much detail. It's got quite a lot of global recognition recently because it quite heavily involves social media and YouTube in the identification of the murderer. Digital experts were involved, and this was a big deal for Northern Ireland, for this wee place somewhere. Like, we don't really have sophisticated crimes like that. I would really appreciate you covering this case. Northern Ireland's a very complicated place, and I really appreciate that you've been here before whenever you did the case on Colin Howell. I actually went to school with his son. That was very traumatic for everybody. But I would really appreciate if you covered the Natalie McNally case, because we have historically, this island and the north in particular, we have had a really bad time at looking for and caring for our women. We're deemed one of the most dangerous places in all of Europe when it comes to being a woman. It's not good. So very, very, very high rates of intimate partner violence. It's terrible. And we are a really small place. It's awful that we have such a high density of crime against women and human rights abuses against women in such a little location. So I'd really appreciate if you could cover that and, put Northern Ireland on the map and draw attention to some of the big social issues that we have here. So thank you again. Love the podcast. Keep it up. And thanks.
Thank you, Megan. Beautiful accent. So, Dick, I wasn't really aware of the violence there in Ireland until the last couple of recommendations we had. Were you aware of this? Are we ignorant?
I was maybe peripherally aware, but it's not something I was thinking about very much.
No, it's something that we definitely could get an education on.
So that'd be a good idea.
Yes, and this is a case where it looks like an intimate partner type of situation. It was December 19th when EMS was called to Natalie's home, and she was found dead. Then there was CCTV footage from the 18th, the day before she was found, which showed a man carrying a backpack arriving onto her street and walking toward her home at 8:52 p.m. And they saw the same figure leaving at 11:30. So on the 21st, police confirmed that they were treating her death as a murder. She'd suffered several stab wounds, and some were apparently defensive. The police also confirmed Natalie was 15 weeks pregnant. So detectives did a search of the Silverwood Golf Club, which was beside her home, and a weapon believed to be used in the murder was recovered by the police. And they said the weapon came from her home. So investigators believed right away that Natalie knew her killer and that they'd had a pre-existing relationship and that she had felt comfortable enough with this person to invite them into her home. Then it was 33-year-old Stephen McCullough, the father of her unborn baby, who they found had been double-gloved, forensically aware, and had created himself a false alibi. So this was meticulously planned according to the police, and they would describe it as sophisticated, calculating, and a cool-headed plot to kill her. So it is a fascinating case, which we'll definitely look more into.
Yeah, obviously we'll see if this man goes to trial and the outcome of the trial, because we'll want to have an entire story to tell you, not a half a story.
Right, and I think Megan did say that the trial is scheduled. It's pending, so I guess it's not scheduled when you say pending.
Right.
Yeah, okay. All right, so let's go on to an email from Yvette, and this is a case suggestion. And she writes, "Can you do the Vincent Brothers case from Bakersfield, California? I love your show and tell everyone about it. Keep up the amazing work." Well, thank you so much, Yvette. Telling people about it, we love that It's a great way for us to find new listeners, so that is very much appreciated.
Absolutely. We love word of mouth.
It's the best way. So this case, Vincent Brothers killed his wife, 3 children, and his mother-in-law in 2003, and he was sentenced to death in 2007. He told authorities he killed his family members because they were a financial drain. Now, this was all pretty shocking because he was a former elementary school vice principal.
Yeah.
But he did have a history of spousal abuse. And there's quite a bit of information on that on the internet. I took a quick look, so.
Yeah, no, there's a lot about this guy.
A lot, yes. So thank you, Yvette. We'll definitely look into doing that as well. Great suggestion. And we have a case suggestion from Jan. Can you read that one, Dick?
Certainly. So Jan says, "Hi, Dick and Jill. I have a suggestion for a story. It's the murder of Noreen Boyle of Mansfield, Ohio, on December 31st, 1989, by her husband. Their son, Collier Landry, has a podcast called Moving Past Murder. I don't have any beer suggestions, since I'm not a beer lover like Dick. Thank you."
Thank you, Jan.
And you don't have to be a beer lover. I still like you.
Of course.
So Dr. John Boyle is an osteopathic physician. Killed his wife Noreen on New Year's Eve, 1989. He struck her in the head and suffocated her with a plastic bag, burying her under the cellar floor. Now his children, who were 3 and 11 at the time, testified against him.
Well, see, I knew the 11-year-old did, but I'd really like to find out how the 3-year-old did.
The 3-year-old just said that she saw Daddy hit Mommy.
Oh, okay.
And she fell to the floor.
All right.
But the 11-year-old was an excellent witness.
And he's the one with the podcast.
And he's the one with the podcast now.
Okay, well, Boyle's wife had filed for divorce at the time, so things weren't good. And it's really a fascinating and disturbing case that is already on our radar because there was a Forensic Files episode that we watched not too long ago about this. So it was fascinating to me because Boyle's mistress, Sherry Lee Campbell, 28 years old, gave birth to a daughter, his daughter, in January of 1990. That's less than 2 weeks after Noreen disappeared. So she'd been with Boyle when he purchased a house and had her sign Noreen's name on the mortgage. Before he bought the home, Boyle had asked about the basement floor and what it was made of, and if he'd be able to put in a sub-basement. And all along, he was planning to bury Noreen there. So that's a hell of a way to start out in your new home with your new wife and baby, to have your other wife buried in the basement.
I can't even begin to talk about that. Just ridiculous stuff.
It's a crazy story. And if I remember correctly from Forensic Files, one of the ways they figured out is he took the cement like with a jackhammer from the basement and put it on some other property that he was connected to in some way. And they found that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this woman who he married, I mean, she was totally involved in this.
I don't know. I really couldn't find anything in the quick look I've done so far that said that she was convicted of anything or if she talked to the police about it. I don't know. But she had to know something was up. If she's going in there and buying a house under the dead woman's name.
Yeah.
So it's just a crazy story, and I'll find out more about it because I think it's fascinating. It's just ludicrous.
Yes, it is.
It is. So thank you, Jan, for your case suggestion. We really appreciate getting case suggestions, whether it's by email, voicemail, a comment on the website. However you do it, we really appreciate it. So thank you, everyone. We're going to wrap things up. We'll see you soon with another episode.
We'll see you at the quiet end.
At the quiet end. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.